What is an ism? A distinctive practice, system, or philosophy. Typically, we think of political isms and also artistic isms. So this image in particular you might associate with communism or Stalinism, or perhaps Suprematism or Constructivism. So we'll talk about all of those things. During this time between the wars, after the First World War and before the Second World War, for the most part, was a birth of some major revolutionary European movements that defined new theories of graphic design. And typically when you think of the word ism, it is about something that has a bunch of rules, that is a way of thinking about a topic, a dogma, a prescribed set of ideas. And that was definitely true at this time with these designers. In Russia, we have the movements Suprematism, Constructivism, and photomontage. In Holland, the Stijl, and the spread of Constructivism. And to point out, we're used to having art isms at this point. We had experienced Cubism and Dadaism a few years earlier before the First World War, and Futurism, a few other movements. But the idea of having some of these kind of formalized movements within the field of graphic design, which, keep in mind, didn't even have a name back then. It was not even called graphic design. These artists would have thought of themselves as commercial artists or just workers, or some of them crossed over from fine art into graphic design, but without really having the words for it. Anyway, theories. So why so many isms at this time? Well, Europe was recovering from World War I. Can't be overstated how traumatic that war was for the civilian population of Europe, how much of an upheaval of everyday life it caused. At the same time, there was a lot of cross-fertilization between fine artists. Sometimes as a result of the war, some people were fleeing and, taking refuge in other countries or having to move not of their own choice. So people were changing countries and learning about other art movements in other parts of Europe. The modern fine art movements that I talked about were well established by then and understood and known. The Cubist movement and Fauvists and Impressionists. So these artists would have understood the recent art history of those movements. Design was starting to form its own theoretical underpinnings as it became more of a separate pursuit, and also as some schools began to form that taught specifically the art of design, both in graphic design and also other kinds of design like product design and furniture design and clothing design and the design of manufactured items. As the post-war economies in Europe were rebuilding and started to boom, we think of the roaring 20s in the United States, and there was some of that roaring was going on, not quite as a pronounced way in Europe, but there were definitely new commercial undertakings, things that needed advertising. Political movements were shifting as a result of the war, so we'll talk about various upheavals and revolutions and the formation of new fascist and communist regimes. And designers felt responsible to really think about big ideas in society. They were well aware of the power of propaganda that had happened during the war, so they felt a new sense of ownership of public ideas and were grappling with questions of war and peace and the meaning of life and the meaning of art and the meaning of design and the purposes of all of those things. In the Meg's book, I like this subhead for this chapter. It was called A New Language of Form. And you'll see that these designers and movements were all moving in the direction of abstraction and geometry. Again, maybe as a result of seeing the incredible power of emotional appeals to the population as part of war propaganda. So kind of taking the emotion and the content out of design seemed like a rational approach and possibly a way to avoid inflaming people with emotional political ideas. They were also moving, again, beyond pictorial content, so moving away from the Kasama cornflower girl, those beggar staff posters, and even the pole vine posters and plakat Stijl priester matches, etc. So moving completely beyond pictorial content and pushing the ideas of Cubism to their natural conclusion, which is complete geometric abstraction. Several of these movements started out as intellectual movements, not art movements, that were based in philosophical, mathematical, and political or social theory. So the artists were not only grappling with shapes and forms on a page, but also a lot of philosophies and theoretical underpinnings, manifestos and books of rules, and a lot of discussion about what everything meant. So just a reminder of what was going on in England and France. Optimistic and forward-looking ideas after the war. This is E. McKnight Coffer in 1924 promoting the London Railroad, and on the right, Cassandra with a promotion for an Atlantic steamer. On the one hand, a sense of optimistic looking forward, like now we've gotten all that war nonsense sorted out behind us. Let's steam forward with all these new technological advances into a happy future, kind of a utopian idea. On the other hand, in Germany, Russia, and Holland, a lot of death and destruction and defeat and economic ruin. And Russia, in particular, was completely torn apart by the destruction of World War I. And as a result of, the festering social conditions, a series of Russian revolutions and a whole new form of government was formed. So this is just showing the life of the Tsars and the royal family, the Russian royals, before the revolution. And, a little bit like Marie Antoinette and her let them eat cake kind of philosophy. When the population is starving, this kind of excess of, that's a Fabergé egg, worth millions of dollars, containing a little golden carriage, a portrait of Catherine the Great. That's a portrait of the Tsar Nicholas, who was in power at the overthrow, and that's the Hermitage Palace in St. Petersburg. So unimaginable wealth and splendor on the part of a few, squalor, starvation, and famine, and death on the part of the population, of the many. The Russian artists had absorbed the ideas of Cubism and Futurism, Cubism being born in France and Futurism being born in Italy, with amazing speed, and quickly moved on to their own innovations. Artists were very important to the Russian Revolution. Art was given a special role, not usually assigned it, to build a new society. And this was in direct opposition to the old order of the aristocracy and the conservative tradition-bound art. And this generation of avant-garde artists were aware of Futurism and Cubism, and luckily were enrolled by the powers that be to put their work to use. This is a piece of poetry from 1914 by David and Vladimir Burliak, I guess is how you say that, and it's an effort to relate visual form to the meaning. This was a little offshoot of Italian Futurism called Russian Futurism, and using mixed type weights and styles, you can see its similarity to the Italian Futurist work that we looked at in terms of trying to make typography expressive and breaking the traditional rules of typesetting. So Suprematism, let's start there. With the movement, the Suprematists believed that art must remain a spiritual activity apart from the utilitarian needs of society. So this idea was that if you separated art as a pure form and it had no content, then it could be left in the spiritual realm. And it's almost like then you wouldn't have to get art involved with politics or commerce, and it could just become a form of pure thought somehow. So rejecting a social or political role for art, and the goal of this movement was to realize a new, true perception of the world by inventing forms in space and time. If you studied Plato's Platonic ideals, the metaphor of the cave, that there exists a pure and perfect version of everything that we see. If we see a chair in the real world, there's a idea of the chair that's even more perfect than an actual chair. So this is a little bit playing into that kind of a classical idea. And you can remember suprematism versus the other movements, because suprematism is about the supremacy, the primacy, the top priority of pure form. So the basic style, though, developed the color palette, and some of the design was partially developed in response to technological limitations, materials shortages in Russia, but with an overlay of an understanding of modernist theories. So the main artist, the inventor of Suprematism, was a man named Kazimir Malevich, or it looks like Malevich, but it's Malevich, with his famous work, The Black Square, from 1913. See a self-portrait of Malevich. His concept of suprematism sought to develop a form of expression that moved as far as possible from objectivity and into subjectivity to access the supremacy of pure feeling and spirituality. He was very quick to assimilate Impressionist, Symbolist, and Fauvist styles, and visited Paris in 1912, where he was exposed to Cubism. He gradually simplified his style, and the black square that he painted in 1915 represented the most radically abstract painting yet seen, and drew an impossible line between old art and new art. This was a breakthrough work of art, first of all, because once you've achieved this, I feel like in a painting, there's almost nowhere else to go. He also did the white square, and this black square was seen as the ultimate replacement, again, for inflammatory or over emotional content. And the best representation of that in his first Suprematism exhibit, the black square was placed in the position on the wall, which was typically reserved for the icon of Christ in a Russian home. It's kind of an odd place to me to hang a picture. I do like the idea of it, though, of like smashing a square into a triangular corner of a room. So this is the ultimate of black squareness. He did many other works. These are all paintings. This is not graphic design. This was fine art in an effort to understand and make the rules and define this movement. This is a construction of what the suprematists called concrete elements of color and shape, where the form is the content is the form, and there's nothing else. It's not about anything else except for squares and rectangles and colors. And the experience that the viewer was supposed to have was just the perceptual effect of looking at color and form and seeing what kind of emotions or feelings pure forms could elicit in the viewer. This is another suprematist composition, a more organic shape in there, that teardrop shape. Another piece by Malevich. And I look at these, and probably you too, they remind me of contemporary posters, and they also remind me of indications of pieces of type. I guess because I'm looking at them as though you could do them in Illustrator, which you definitely could. This would be a great exercise to learn how to use Adobe Illustrator. But of course, he was painting them with his hand and a brush on a canvas or on a board, and making those perfect shapes and compositions. Next artist that we'll look at is L. Lissitzky. He was born Lazar Markovich Lissitzky. He was a Lithuanian Jewish and shortened his own name to L. Lissitzky. Malevich was his mentor, and together they worked on the ideas and developed those ideas of suprematism. An important part of Lissitzky's life all the way through was teaching and talking and writing about art. Lissitzky started teaching at age 15, eventually carrying some of his ideas to Weimar, Germany, and affecting the Bauhaus, which is our next lecture. And his ideas have been carried on down the line. He was denied admittance to art school at age 19 because of his Jewish heritage, and instead studied architectural engineering in Germany from 1911 to 1914 before the war. Then his studies were interrupted by the war. So his basis of his art was formed in math and architecture. He ended up teaching at the art school in Vitebsk. He believed that the revolution was a new beginning for mankind, and believed that communism, social engineering, technology, and the designer would work together to provide mankind with a richer society and environment that would be more fair. Lissitzky helped Suprematism and Constructivism concepts move into Western Europe because he ended up traveling after the war, again with a little bit more freedom of movement allowed. And he gave lectures around at different schools in Europe, wrote articles, and did design jobs for various publications. So he definitely started out in the school of Suprematism. You can see from these paintings here, this is called Prown. He invented the word, a painting style he called Prowns, which was Projects for the Establishment of a New Art. It was an acronym in Russian. And in contrast to Malevich's absolute flatness, you can see the influence of architecture on Lissitzky. He introduced some 3D illusions and was interested in the idea of merging painting and architecture. So these also really look like floating pieces of animation or, exercises. They're very computer feeling to me. This was done again in 1919 with paint on canvas. A couple more of his Prowns. Just, again, I just can't get away from computer vision. Where Lissitzky parted from the suprematist idea or changed it was to try to take these abstract shapes and forms and apply them to applied art. So this is a message in 1919, a call to arms for the revolution. The title of it inside of the painting says, "Beat the whites with the red wedge." This was a political statement. The whites were the Tsarist white army forces, and the red wedge is the Bolshevik army. And so it's really like a military diagram and kind of a propaganda poster, but this time done with pure shape and form. One of the most famous pieces of graphic design in history. A few years later, this is 1921 to 22, and you can see how the attempt that he's making to combine typography with form and to turn type also into pure form. The new Russian Soviet government offered encouragement to these artists and published their art in international journals. This is the first cover of a trilingual journal. And you can see that Lissitzky is working on this diagonal axis with asymmetrical balancing elements. So it's really becoming an exercise of geometry. This is a sketch. This is a magazine called Broom, which was a radical American magazine covering art. And it shows his practice of making layouts on graph paper, again, like using the tools of architecture and thinking in three-dimensional perspective. He's got this modular structure and the mathematical order of a grid. And he's forming the typography by using the squares of the grid, reiterating that there was an international audience for these kinds of experimentation in art. This is a photogram by Lissitzky and also a poster. So as he's traveling around lecturing and being involved in the establishment of the communist state, he is also working for commercial clients. So this is produced in a darkroom by placing an object directly on photographic paper. There's a light source, you can see from the left that's casting shadows of objects onto the photographic paper, including a glass jar, so that gives that interesting shadow and transparency, and then probably a hand-lettered pelican typography on a piece of tracing paper or something like that. And this is important as a shift in graphic design because here by 1925, we can see how the Gutenberg system of metal type is becoming a thing of the past, and that photomechanical reproduction, being able to create photographic works in the darkroom and then reproduce those using halftone screens, is allowing much more flexibility in the creation of typography. This cover was for a magazine called For the Voice. We've got this nice right angle animated by some squares and circles. This is the interior of that book cover for The Voice. And these are poems that are meant to be read out loud. Each poem has its own spread that's illustrated with abstract elements that help to signify the content of the poem. And notice the really interesting navigational tabs on the right-hand side. Lissitzky, like his counterpart Ladislav Sutnar, was interested in ways of organizing information. And if you see a resemblance to icons on the web and page navigation systems down the side of a page, that's no coincidence, because his organizational systems were studied by the early designers of the World Wide Web. There's really interesting spatial compositions and contrast between elements on the pages of this book, and the relationship of the forms to the negative space of the paper, with some things being outlined as though it's image, and then the other side is the poem. You can see here is abstracted Navy ship, and another work by L. Lissitzky, a book cover coincidentally called The Isms of Art, so 1924. In both Suprematism and Constructivism, they eventually, in their commercial form, made use of typography, and these both become the forms most identified with the art of the revolution. Today, there's all kinds of tropes and memes that use these classic posters and works of design from the Russian era of the Russian Revolution to represent, when people do a modern day, Time magazine cover using some of these type styles, were meant to associate them with communism or Stalinism or totalitarianism. So constructivism, Lissitzky actually is a great bridge because he somewhat crossed the line in developing from Suprematism to Constructivism. Constructivism was developed after 1925. With Stalin taking power in Russia, it was difficult to pursue experimental work that was seen as more frivolous. And so his idea was to work on USSR in Construction, which was a series of architectural propaganda publications that were distributed internationally and that talked about the actual physical buildings of the new state. This is a poster for a Russian exhibition in Switzerland in 1929, made with photomontage, which is the technique of printing multiple negatives onto the same piece of paper when you're making darkroom prints. And then sometimes they were physically cut out and glued together, so montaged in the sense of collage, but also multiple prints from different negatives. And this is interesting because it's portraying the youth of this collective society that are kind of cloned into an anonymous multi-gender being above the exhibition design that was designed by Lissitzky. So just to differentiate between the early theory of suprematism, 1915, the black square and a Malevich composition on the left, and then Lissitzky's subsequent work where his pronouns were evolved from the Malevich forms and then eventually moving into a functional design. Another artist working in the constructivism movement was Alexander Rodchenko. He was an ardent communist, and we know him mostly for his developments in photomontage, although you can see that Lissitzky was experimenting with it, that became a key element of Rodchenko's work. He abandoned painting completely in 1921, turning to visual communication only, and he believed that he had a sense of responsibility to the larger society instead of just personal expression with art, that all art should be functional. So it's interesting that both of these ideas developed in Russia, one right after the other, one being that art should have no purpose at all and be purely formal, and the other one is that purely formal art is an indulgence and that all art should work for the good of the people. Okay, this is a portrait of Lilia Brick, a fellow avant-garde artist by Alexander Rodchenko. He was a photographer as well as a designer. Of course, this is the one element for this most famous piece, probably, and one that is constantly repurposed and used, again, kind of a symbol of communism. And the product that she's advertising here is books. This was a statement about the availability of books in the Soviet regime. And Rodchenko and his partners did a bunch of advertising, the first advertising for Soviet product. This is one of his magazine covers. This Lef magazine covered all fields of the creative arts, and it was a design that was based on strong and static horizontal and vertical lines. And you can see this was issue number 1, but the basic format, which I think is a really interesting, unusual format for book covers. There was over 100 of these. So now they were small pamphlets, about 5 by 8-ish size. This was number 2. You see some children in there. There were often used images of children and youth to symbolize the new society. And you've got this bold, blocky type and heart edge shapes against softer forms inside of the photomontage. Each one was printed in 2 color. The 2 colors differ between issues. This is another interesting photo montage with a little piece of clip art in there. Photo montage was Rodchenko's effort to create a new illustration technique that was appropriate to the 20th century, that both had the imaginative possibilities of painting, but with the realistic properties of photography. Again, he was a fantastic photographer, and you can see the similarities in his pure photographs with the photo montage, this inclination for strong diagonal lines and very graphic shapes. He's catching things. This was a piece as he was working for the totalitarian state. There was, again, Stalin had that same kind of interest in physical culture and developing citizens as athletes and as warriors in between the wars. So this was 1934, same time as those Leni Riefenstahl photographs in Germany. So Russian photomontage was, again, a radically new art form, and it was developed at the same time and place as the idea of montage in film. There was a Russian filmmaker named Sergei Eisenstein was the inventor of montage in film. They had common techniques between film and print: simultaneous action, superimposing images, extreme close-ups, interesting perspectives, and rhythmically repeating the same image, whether in film or in still photography. This was a series, again, of paperback book covers, different series, but the same idea, standard geometric format that was printed with black and a second color. The title and the number and the second color change with each book. And when you put them all together, it's almost like a serial painting. They go, the action kind of continues from one cover to the next, to the next, to the next, and develops over time. They would have looked really wonderful on a shelf together. So this was from 1924. Close-up of a magazine spread by Rodchenko. Poster. You can tell we're getting closer to war here. Those are anti-aircraft guns. Cover for a book called The World Belongs to Kirsanov I love the combination of photography and drawing in the little character. A good collage technique, and then all the interesting typography organization with those horizontal rules and then diagonal type and uses of multiple different typefaces. It's really got all kinds of fun Dadaist energy that's all blended into a constructivist design. Another famous pair of collaborators, George and Vladimir Augustovich Stenberg, the Stenberg brothers. They collaborated on designs mostly for theater and film, and they understood a lot about and experimented a lot with reproduction of photos. So they would often make realistic drawings by enlarging film frames using projection and grids and then translating them into drawings, as was done in the background here. So the background of this poster is drawn, and then the cut apart heroine of the film is in the middle with this wonderful typographic vortex that sucks you in. Another master of photomontage was Gustav Klutzis. This is a series of posters, Everyone Must Vote in the Election of Soviets. This is from 1930. He referred to the medium of propaganda montage as the art construction for socialism and was convinced that photomontage was the medium of the future. He's also another person that, his work has been widely imitated and parodied. This is a wonderful mock-up, not a real sculpture, but a sculpture by Vladimir Tatlin, who was working with the Constructivists. And as they were interested in the idea of photomontage and abstraction in print, he was constructing a montage of elements that was an abstraction of a monumental sculpture. So instead of having a portrait of a person, this was kind of the uprising of the Soviet state as an abstraction. It's a staircase going on up. One of my favorite artists, Vladimir Vasilyevich Lebedev, graphic Soviet designer, constructivist, I would say, who was creating children's books. Again, literacy, the one positive thing from the communist revolution was the idea that literacy was widespread. People, all the peasants who before had not been schooled were taught to read. There were state schools, and so a new need for children's books. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, similar things were going on. Curiously mirrored movement, minus the communism. So the style De Stijl took its name from a magazine edited by the Dutch painter, designer, and writer Theo van Doesburg. It was launched in the Netherlands in the late summer of 1917, again, right before the end of the war. In case you don't know where the Netherlands are, you can see they're squeezed between Germany and Belgium, just above France, across the English Channel from the United Kingdom. That's the land of Hollands. That's the land of tulips and windmills and canals and modernism. There's a city one of the main cities in Holland is Utrecht, which you might know the name of because it's a big art store here. And there's a famous art school there that the art store is named after. On the bottom, you can see this interesting housing made from container ships that's in the city, I believe, of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. That's modern. It's new within the 2000s, but harkens back to the style that we'll talk about here. So the origins of this movement of De Stijl, which means the style, very straightforward, was a philosopher named M.H.J. Schoenemacher, who defined the horizontal and the vertical as the two fundamental opposites that shape the world, along with red, yellow, and blue, the three principal colors. So again, a movement that was begun this time by a philosopher and mathematician, and then taken up by van Doesburg, who was a mathematician and ultimately influenced probably the person you may be more familiar with, Pierre Mondrian. So there's the Schoenemacher's book, and some diagrams from inside. All kinds of these. Again, these diagrams were not just meant to be mathematical explanations of the world, but meant to be more philosophical and spiritual explanations of the world. The movement concerned itself with developing an abstract, universal style of equilibrium and harmony, with the goal of purifying art by banning naturalistic representation, external values, and subjective expressions. So again, if you think about the position of the Netherlands during World War I, smushed up there on the edge. I showed you some propaganda from the war. They were invaded early. They were to be invaded again in World War II. But it makes sense that they were trying to desperately to say, wait a minute, how can we use artwork to kind of clean things up in the world, make it all pure and new again, take away the emotion that might lead to bad things, and create something that is hopefully better. The ideas of Stijl emphasized spiritual harmony and order, abstraction and universality, the reduction to essential form and color, the reduction to vertical and horizontal lines, which often did not intersect, the use of primary colors, and the use of black and white or color and non-color. Again, trying to just reduce everything back down to, like, if we strip away all meaning and everything that could have any kind of association, what do we end up with? Basically, these essential opposites, this unity idea of opposites, of horizontal versus vertical, of black versus white, or color versus non-color, and the essential elements of color. Love this is a portrait, again, a self-portrait of Mondrian, P.A. Mondrian. I believe I directed you to that wonderful little short film that shows the evolution of his work from pictorial to non-pictorial. Again, what kills me about it that I love so much is just looking at the amount of thought and effort, as you can almost like feel the gears in his mind going around and around as he's working his way from that idea of horizon line and vertical trees to something that looks like the piece on the left. So we've got these two masters of reduction, Mondrian in Holland and Malevich in Moscow, both kind of arriving at the same place through different means. This is a composition of Mondrian's in 1922 called Composition with Red, Yellow, and Blue. His paintings became the source from which Stijl's philosophy and visual forms were developed afterwards, and the search for universal harmony became the subject. This is much later, 1943, after I guess in the middle of World War II, as he moved to the United States and was interested in the expression of jazz, and also how the grid of gridded streets in Manhattan. Of course, Mondrian lives on. This is fashion inspired by him from the 1960s. The color block idea came back around. His genius began to be appreciated in the late 1950s, early 60s. Before that, kind of had fallen out of favor. And then it just never seems to go away. The color block idea with these black and red, yellow, and blue, plus now other colors. And I wonder what Mondrian would think. Do you think he would be pleased that his art has been dumbed down to the level of a bow tie and a Swatch watch? Or do you think he would be inspired? Do you think he would think that people are missing the point? I don't know. Another version of it, hotel in somewhere in the Netherlands Antilles, I believe. So Mondrian, still always a fine artist, did not apply his philosophy to design, but his ideas were quickly taken up by others, including Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and Bart van der Lek. So Bart van der Lek was another Dutchman, and Moholy-Nagy, I believe, was Czechoslovakian. This is a book cover from 1925 about, again, different movements from Theo van Doesburg to the Bauhaus. Bart van der Lek, the same designer, Dutch designer, poster in 1915, and you can see with this preliminary layout, this is the sketch of the poster, showing that he's trying to figure out how to bring that some kind of order to this design by dividing the space into rectangles and even kind of rectanglifying the people and the boat. This is a poster for the Batavia line, which was a transport line between Rotterdam and London. Here he's arrived at his final solution. I'll go back again. You can see from sketch to final design, definitely inspired by the Mondrian ideas. It's a direct application of de Stijl into graphic design with the flat color and bold horizontal and vertical lines that frame the design. Here is a designer named Vilmos Hazar doing the cover for the magazine de Stijl in 1917. Hazar designed a logo with letters constructed from an open grid of squares and rectangles again. And then the corresponding artwork. I can almost see a figure in that central illustration, or maybe it's just buildings, a landscape. Inside title pages, you can see there's an ad on the left for Guillaume Apollinaire, who I mentioned way back at the beginning as a symbolist poet, a French symbolist poet. So this is 1918 at the end of the war. Grid system. Here's a copy of the cover for de Stijl number 8 with type asymmetrically balanced, and the four corners of your mind kind of creates an interior rectangle within the rectangle of the page. Again, this is that new kind of typography that was probably done photographically as opposed to being set with metal type so that it can be manipulated. That number 8 looks very hand-drawn to me. I love this. This is interior page, and these are actually 5 different ads produced for the magazine and announcements, 1921. So whether you were producing plastic art, I think Valori Plastiki, an edition of the next magazine, some gallery shows, and everything looks like it belongs to the same grid as the magazine. Inside, this is an article featuring some Dada poetry and typography. This was the philosopher Theo van Doesburg writing poems under a pseudonym of I.K. Bonset. And here we have the de Stijl artist Theo van Doesburg collaborating with the Dada artist Kurt Schwitters to create a poster about a Dada party, the Dada soiree. And I love in there's a little picture of a deer head and some other stuff they were using. I do believe in this they were using some metal type objects combined with the more cut freeform, torn out of the newspaper Dada bit. This the de Stijl movement also there were artists working that were architects, much like these Prowns. I feel like if you just translated one of his Liszewski paintings into an actual physical shape, you would get this house. And again, these artists were aware of each other. At least in the period between the wars, the de Stijl people in the Netherlands and Liszewski and Rodchenko in Russia had some communication with each other. This was a project for a family, the Schroeder family, and you can see what the old style architecture in this neighborhood looked like with the house next door, typical Dutch row houses made out of brick, and then suddenly up went this radical new idea by the architect Gerrit Rietveld. Apparently the children that lived in the Schroeder house were ostracized and bullied at school, and it had rocks thrown at it from the outside because people just freaked out and hated it so much. This is an interior layout. This is the idea echoed from the arts and crafts movement in England a few years earlier of being an a house that was totally designed. So everything inside of the house is designed to be extremely functional and for it all to match together so that nothing sticks out or doesn't belong. So every piece of furniture, all of the storage systems, the stairs, lights, everything were designed by Rietveld. The way that the blinds were pulled down, all incredibly radical for the time. And one of his famous items that's left over since this era of design is his famous red-blue chair, which most people just call the Rietveld chair, which is supposed to be curiously comfortable because the incline of at the back is kind of just right. It doesn't look very comfortable, but it's still sold. You can buy these, and if you had an original one made by him or an early manufacturing run, it would be a collectible worth a lot of money. And here we have guest art director L. Lissitzky working on a cover and a page design from Stijl magazine in 1922. Von Doesburg invited Lissitzky to design and edit a double issue of Stijl that represented a tale of two squares in Dutch. So you can see L. Lissitzky, Suprematism, and Van Doesburg, Stijl, marrying nicely. So as the ideas of constructivism, of this sort of new applied art of pure forms, a language of pure form, spreading with the influence of Stijl across Europe, we have the designer Henryk Berlewy in Poland, who opened an advertising firm in Warsaw, and he introduced constructivism into Polish graphic design through industrial and commercial advertisements, which, if you think about it, is kind of funny because you've got this movement in Russia that's all about creating the, collective state and that there is no capitalism. And yet the ideas of the collectivist art form, constructivism, were quickly adopted and used for commercial purposes. There's Henryk Berlewy with a Daimler car in 1924 with very cool works of suprematism on the wall behind him, along with photographs of cars. And here's one of his ads. This is an ad for chocolates. Not obvious that it's an ad for chocolates, but Pluto's Chocolates. This is a page from the brochure, page 6. And he hoped that commercial advertising could become a vehicle for abolishing the divide between the artist and society. So although he's working for, doing ads for capitalist products, he's still thinking that the art itself can be a form of social change. We also have the Czechoslovakian artist Ladislav Sutnar. This is a design cover for a book called Getting Married by George Bernard Shaw. I don't know if it's the Czech edition. You can see the incredible organizational simplicity. Everyone knows the problem with a love triangle, as it were, and the just fantastic composition there that almost forms a perspective in space with a smaller woman in the background. Sutnar was a multidisciplinary designer, another one of my faves, who also ended up working in New York on catalog design. He also taught at the Bauhaus and created this beautiful, simple porcelain service in 1929, as well as a building block set. This was a prototype for it in 1943. And here's another cover design for a government publication about minimal housing in 1931, so illustrating the conceptual idea of minimalist architecture. So I think that you can see what I just love when a person has such a strong style that they can design toys and dinnerware and an architecture magazine cover, and they all look related, like they came from the same person. This is a cover from a design magazine, avant-garde publication that he did numerous covers for, called I-10. This is one of the purest examples of Stijl principles applied to typography. Demonstrates the collaboration of constructivism and Stijl again. if you can think about the kind of busy and fun and loudness of Rodchenko and the discipline of Mondrian merged together to create this. What I also like when you look at these historical works of graphic design, you start to realize the importance of the graphic designer just publishing magazines for their own fun. A lot of the artifacts that have come down from these ages are works about graphic design. So if there's nobody else to design for, you can always design your own publication. The lasting effects of both of these movements, well, of the Constructivist movement and the de Stijl movement in particular, are the quest for pure art of visual relationships, pure abstraction, which remained a major influence on all 20th century visual arts, from fine art to graphic design, to title design and all kinds of other pieces, and also became a dominant direction in graphic design. And the idea of geometric construction in organizing space and information, basically using the geometry of circles, squares, and grids, is kind of the overwhelming idea of graphic design in the 20th century from here on out. So whether it's a White Stripes album cover from early 2000 named de Stijl, or some furniture designed in Brazil, a chair and a table, or the design of the interface of Windows 8, or a map designed in 2007 for a town in the Netherlands, or the exposure of poster design based on the grid in 2020, the ideas of squares, circles, and white space and black lines are not going away anytime soon. Just remember, whenever you're faced with a grid, it has a spiritual origin. That's all. Thanks for watching.